Okay, hello. So if you're new to the channel, I use data science to answer questions that are mostly stupid, sometimes serious. And before we get into today's video, I do want to quickly acknowledge that there are a lot more people here than there were when I uploaded my last video. Some of y'all are more interested in data science, and some of y'all are more interested in commentary and internet culture. And moving forward, I will try and create content that keeps everyone happy. Today's video, however, is one that I'm sure no one really wants. Yet another take on Star Wars. But this one involves data. So ever since Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012, I've always been fascinated by how Disney would handle the very sprawling Star Wars saga. If you've ever entered a bookstore, you will know there's a very robust expanded universe that doesn't just include books, it includes books, obviously, comics, radio shows, I'm pretty sure, video games, magazines, holiday specials, you name it. And of course the movies, the TV shows, and all of the novelizations of those stories. So in 2014, which was 2 years after the Disney acquisition, Disney decided to retroactively make a lot of that expanded universe material non-canon and rebranded it as Star Wars Legends. And naturally, a lot of fans were mad. People have invested a lot of time into reading these books, and to have them no longer be a part of the canon might feel like you wasted your time with those stories. But I think the general consensus at the time was that it was a wise decision. Like, the decision was made around the time that we knew Disney was going to be making films set in the future, so it didn't quite make sense to have this expanded universe telling us what happens in the next 100 years in the Star Wars universe and then also make films and somehow surprise us, you know? Like, if they were adhering to the original canon, then they were really quite limited in terms of what they could tell in the sequel films. Why am I telling you all this? Well, this single decision to split the Star Wars timeline into Legends and Canons had a lot of repercussions, both on the Star Wars story, the Star Wars franchise, fans. It's really kind of a fascinating story. And in this video, we will be taking a data-driven approach to exploring the Star Wars canon versus the Star Wars Legends and seeing all of the repercussions of that decision. So even nixing all of the expanded universe lore that Disney did, the current canon timeline of Star Wars is still pretty vast. Luckily, Wikipedia maintains 2 distinct timelines of canon and legends. So what I did was I scraped all of those events and then put together some timelines that we can use to compare the 2 factions of media. So just as a refresher, this is the current canon timeline. This includes all the movies, this includes some of the canon books, the Clone Wars, the Mandalorian, everything post-Disney, and a selection of expanded universe lore from pre-Disney. Quick explanation of how the years in Star Wars works. So the Battle of Yavin, which is when Luke blew up the Death Star in episode 4, represents like the 0th year of the Star Wars calendar. So years are either marked as before Battle of Yavin or after Battle of Yavin. It's very similar to like Common Era or like BC AD. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at this timeline of the current Star Wars canon. Yeah, there's like several thousand years of timeline, even getting rid of a lot of the expanded universe lore. So yeah, it's not like Disney completely got rid of like a lot of the ancient history or even the like after sequel events. Like, there's still stuff that they maintained outside of the films, but as you'll see, it really doesn't even scratch the surface of what Legends covers. And just to get your bearings, the prequels took place from 32 to 19 BBY. The original trilogy took place from 0 to 4 ABY. And the sequels took place from 34 to 35 ABY. Right away, one of the takeaways I had from creating this timeline was like, oh, the sequel trilogy didn't have any time skips. I don't know how I didn't register that when watching them, but yeah, I mean, the prequel trilogies covered the longest time span, obviously, because you're with Anakin from when he was a child and watching him age into maturity. The original trilogy, there was a time skip as well, but yeah, everything that happens in the sequel trilogies took place in less than 2 years, which is interesting. It was an interesting choice, right? And the general sequence of events makes sense here, right? It's like prehistory, ancient history, then the Republic age, you're seeing the rise of the Galactic Republic, which is when the prequels are happening, then the Imperial age, which is when the original trilogy is happening, and then the New Republic era, the new sort of 2-year war during the sequels, and then the after period. This timeline really exists just so you all can get a refresher of the Star Wars events and start thinking in terms of BBY and ABY. There's not really much insight to be drawn here, so let's move on to the next graph. Okay, so this graph is comparing the canon timeline and the Legends timelines at a glance. It's nothing too in-depth, but there's an obvious takeaway here, which is that the timeline that the Legends media covers is far longer than the timeline for the canon. So Legends starts at 14 million BBY. Canon timeline starts at about like 35,000. A lot of the events at the beginning of the canon timeline have unclear years, but Legends, everything is very super specific. Yeah, and you can just see Legends just has so much more, so many more events. Like the reason all of the individual rectangles in the Legends graph are so much smaller is because you're cramming so many events into the same size as the one for the canon timeline. If you compare these two color keys, you can see that the Legends timelines has like so many more defined eras. It isn't just necessarily Jedi versus Sith or like Republic versus Empire. Like there's a lot of different power structures that are explored, a lot of different societies that are explored, and you can't necessarily say the same for the canon timeline. It also has a considerable amount of stories that take place after the Battle of Yavin, and into the future, into like the 150 ABY, because Legends, as we'll get to later, does follow the story of people post Luke, Leia, post Rey, I guess. Like there are new characters introduced in Legends. But what are some of those differences? Let's take a deeper look. So I developed this interactive timeline of canon versus Legends. Canon events are on the left, Legends events are on the right. You can hover over the squares to get more details of each event. And if you want to play around with this timeline, there will be a link in the description. Okay, but we will be using this timeline to point out some of the key differences. So, as I implied at the beginning, ancient history is much more fleshed out in Legends. There are entire story arcs dedicated to the history of the Jedi and Sith orders, respectively, and also the various wars they fought over the years. In canon, that history is very much still there. It's not as much of an emphasis, and I would say, based off of the research that I've done, they're more passing references than they are story arcs. There's also an emphasis on the development of space and technology in Legends. So, military research for one, there are stories dedicated to prehistoric weapons and how the lightsabers were developed and super weapons that the Sith used before the Death Star. There's quite a bit of information on trading routes and systems and how Corellia, for example, came to be an economic power, or how the Kessel Run was established. And one thing I find fascinating about both canon and Legends is that prehistory is divided into like pre-hyperspace travel and post-hyperspace travel. So I just think it's so interesting that you have a civilization where you are thinking of people as being ancient beings and also being capable of hyperspace travel. Like that's just like a basic achievement, like it's their version of the wheel. I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic, and I'm glad it's being explored in these expanded universe books. I would argue that canon and Legends diverge the most when it comes to the Mandalorian culture. This stuff has been retconned so many times. Boba Fett's extreme popularity in Empire Strikes Back led to many EU stories exploring his home planet and his home culture. You know, Boba Fett was obviously introduced as a bounty hunter who worked for the dark side. So a lot of these earlier stories painted the Mandalorians as the bad guys, as evil warriors who had waged war against the Jedi and lost, and a culture that frequently aligned itself with the dark side. All of these stories also revolved around Boba Fett and Jango Fett, his father, to the point where Jango Fett and Boba, I believe, both became Mandalore at one point. And the Mandalore is the person who is sort of the leader of all the Mandalorians. Later interpretations of the Mandalorians, however, presented the group as less of a monolith and more of a collection of factions. So there are cults, there are rebellions, all of whom take their religion to varying degrees of severity. You know, the conflict with the Jedi is very much still there, but the focus on later stories is more on the internal conflicts and civil wars between the Mandalorians. And like, if you watch the Clone Wars, like a major arc of it was the siege of Mandalore, like the taking back of the planet. And these are, of course, all themes that continue to be explored in Disney's show, The Mandalorian. And now, of course, the other area that canon and legends diverge is everything after the original trilogy. So, just to give you an idea, in Legends, Luke ends up marrying a woman named Mara Jade, and they have kids. The Skywalker saga continues through Luke and Mara Jade's kids, and we follow them and their children, and so on and so on and so on. You've got people like Jason Solo, Ben Skywalker, Anya Solo, like all people who were kids of the characters who we grew to love in the original trilogy, and all had very fulfilling arcs in their own right, and the stories followed them instead. Now, obviously none of these characters exist in the sequel trilogies or any of the Disney shows or movies. And this was one of the main reasons why Disney did away with Legends in the first place, right? There's really no way for them to create compelling stories and surprise fans if they're using the same characters from the expanded universe, right? As soon as they introduce a Ben Skywalker or an Anya Solo in the films, we know exactly what trajectory or like what personality they have. It's no longer intriguing or fresh. And the thing is, these stories may have been erased from canon, but so many events and characters have been lifted from the expanded universe in recent Disney stories. So Dave Filoni, especially, who is at the helm of The Mandalorian and was a showrunner for the Clone Wars, he's known to have mined Legends for ideas and absorb a lot of those events back into the Disney canon. If you've been keeping up with The Mandalorian, this is no surprise. It is extremely obvious what Filoni is trying to do with the second season. Now I want to scroll up to the top. So when I was scraping events from Wikipedia, obviously each of them have a source tag on them. So I scraped all of the source tags too. So the great thing about this timeline is that we know where each of these events came from. We know whether it came from the expanded universe, whether it came from the original films, the prequels, the sequels, Clone Wars, etc. The way I designed this is there's all these checkboxes next to each of the types of media. And if you haven't watched something, if you don't want spoilers for them, you can just simply deactivate those lightsabers and they're gone from the timeline. A side note, I do want to take a minute to applaud myself for the design of these lightsabers. It did take me like 6 hours to figure out the proper CSS alignment because web design isn't my forte, but yeah, I think they look great. The main reason I wanted to explain that is because look what happens when I uncheck extended universe. Yeah, everything goes away. And this is even more obvious if I just check that back on. And then I toggle this switch here, which says color by media instead of era. And yeah, all of these light purple events are from the extended universe. All of them. So yes, it's very obvious, and I didn't have to make this visualization to even come to this conclusion, but it is very obvious that the expanded universe is responsible for like 90% of the Star Wars lore. Literally, like, throwaway lines in the original trilogy will become the basis of like entire books and entire video games. So of course, all the details that we know about the Star Wars universe, like everything on Wikipedia, all of that is mostly coming from these novelizations. The extended universe is so comprehensive to the point that if you know the EU, or if you've read the Wikipedia summaries like I have, you can practically predict where a Star Wars story is going based off of really the most minute of details. So, spoilers for Mandalorian Season 2. Don't get me wrong, it was gratifying to see characters like Ahsoka, like Bo-Katan, but their presence implies certain things about the story, right? Bo-Katan shows up. Okay, so we know the story will be tackling the Siege of Mandalore at some point, especially because we've seen the Darksaber in this show, and the showrunners have tried to convince us that it's important. Ahsoka had a brief line asking where Thrawn was, and that made fans go, well, okay, that must mean that Ezra's alive, and he must show up either in this show or in Ahsoka's spin-off show. Literally all we have is a title for Ahsoka spin-off, and people already have a good idea of what beats or what events they might cover in that first season. And of course, this is how fandoms work nowadays. Everyone is obsessed with predicting the next big thing. But I feel that the effects are almost exacerbated for the Star Wars universe, because it isn't like comic books where you have multiple plot lines and parallel universes and you really have your pick of the land in terms of where to go with the next story. And it's not like James Bond where like the through line is like one character and the movies don't necessarily have to connect with one another. Like you can just have isolated stories. Like Star Wars is very much an episodic story. You know, despite what we thought with The Mandalorian, everything has to connect in some way. But this is a narrative season with only 2 versions of a timeline to pick from. But the way things are going, those 2 timelines are very quickly becoming one. I will expand on that. Regardless, does the predictability of Star Wars make it less enjoyable? For me, yeah, it does. For you, maybe not. And this isn't a new problem just because of Disney. This has been happening in the Star Wars universe really since the prequels, right? Like Star Wars has always been constrained by the events of the original trilogy. For example, we know that Anakin needed to father Luke and Leia, so enter Padme, a very bland character who I assure you would not have been written into the prequels if they didn't need someone to give birth to Luke and Leia. It's a shame because the original trilogy is known for having one of the most iconic plot twists of all time. And I don't think anyone has really been surprised in that way by anything that's come out of the Star Wars universe since then. And if fans have been surprised, it's because of shock reveals or shock deaths. It's not a genuinely surprising character moment or reveal. It's usually just something that relies on nostalgia for characters from the original trilogy. For example, the big twist in The Force Awakens was that Han died. In The Last Jedi, Luke unexpectedly dies. In the Rise of Skywalker, the reveal is that Rey is actually a Palpatine. Right? All of the big plot twists are in some ways connected to the events of the original trilogy. And even in The Mandalorian, the big plot twists are usually character reveals. People like Boba Fett, people like Bo-Katan. I don't know. You might disagree with me on that. Jenny Nicholson has a fantastic library of Star Wars videos that are so fun to watch in retrospect because she is able to predict major plot points in the films based off of like a planet's environment or like the presence of a species in a certain scene. And like there's a plethora of YouTube channels who will watch a 30-second trailer, break it down, and basically honestly spoil a lot of the events in the movies. It's impressive, but it's also indicative of how bloated the Star Wars lore is getting, to the point where maybe we know a little bit too much as fans. And this issue is only going to be compounded because Disney is releasing like 11 new TV shows over the next few years and a few films all set in the Star Wars universe. The more these stories intersect with each other, the more complex the timelines get, the less fun these stories are going to be to watch, at least for me. So, spoilers for The Mandalorian again. By the finale, we know that Luke rescues Grogu at the end. We also know that all of the young Jedi that trained under Luke were killed, which we learned in The Last Jedi. So does this mean that Grogu is dead? Does this mean that Grogu leaves Luke for Mando? I don't know, but it's an issue that the writers now have to write around because they forced it to intersect with the events of the sequel trilogy, right? Similarly, we know that Grogu was in the temple when Anakin killed all of the younglings. So how did Grogu survive that massacre? Did Anakin know that Grogu survived? Did he have an ally? I don't know. Yet another issue that the writers can either quietly leave under the rug or will have to write around. These are all problems that you wouldn't get in typical storytelling because stories are usually written linearly, right? This is just too much. Like, Star Wars is becoming a tangled web where we as the fans know too much and the writers are restricted too much in their storytelling. And here's where it starts to get shitty. These Legends books in the expanded universe are becoming the backbone of the new Filoni-verse, as people like to say, all of the shows that will be produced under Dave Filoni. These stories will be raking in millions of dollars for Disney over the next few years. And the authors of these books are not getting paid. So you might have seen this hashtag DisneyMustPay. There wasn't, like about a month ago, there was a big uproar surrounding Alan Dean Foster, who had written the novelizations of the original trilogy Star Wars films. And when Disney acquired those films from Lucasfilm, they stopped paying royalties to Alan. The logic, I guess, being that, well, we just bought the properties, we didn't necessarily buy the obligations of Lucasfilm to pay you royalties. It's obviously bullshit, but Disney is like a mega corporate power, so they have the ability to say shit like that and have writers buckle. Regardless, after that story caught a lot of steam, we learned more about the situation. He is not the only author who isn't getting paid for his stories. And it's obviously a huge injustice, but it's like doubly a slap in the face when you consider the Star Wars landscape for the next few years. Like, one of the recently announced projects on Disney Investor Day was this new movie called Rogue Squadron. That movie is like very likely to be based off of the book of the same name. And if it's not based off the book's presence is hyping up this movie within the fan community, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't know anything about it. It would just be a title. Not to mention, like, every new planet or species you see in Star Wars has likely been taken from an existing book in the expanded universe. And like I said at the top, Disney has Frankensteined and retconned elements of the legend stories into their new canon. So like Jyn Erso of Rogue One is like very clearly based off of a character from the books named Jan Ors. And the ending of The Rise of Skywalker, in which Palpatine is resurrected, is like beat for beat the same story as that's in the Dark Empire comics. It's the corporate equivalent of when you say, you can copy my homework, but just make sure you change the answers. Except in this scenario, the authors did not give their express permission for Disney to copy their answers. So yeah, at the end of the day, Disney, you gotta pay, because it is becoming increasingly obvious to me that without the expanded universe, your writers would have no idea what to do. And I don't think I'm the only one who's gonna come to that conclusion. But yeah, that's the end of this video. I have so much Star Wars related data based off of what I scraped from Wikipedia. I honestly probably could have turned this data set into like 5 different videos if I wanted to, but I'm not gonna do that because I know that franchise fatigue is a thing, and I will not wear you out. I will give you some diversity of videos before I ever revisit Star Wars. But if you do want me to revisit Star Wars, let me know what questions you would like me to investigate. I do have very exciting videos planned for the coming year, some more data science-y projects, some more culture projects, and of course, more projects analyzing YouTube and the state of content creators. So yeah, I'm just super excited for the new year and everything that it will bring for me and this channel. And yeah, as always, follow me on Twitter at vastava_ to stay up to date with me and my projects. Subscribe, like to see all of my new projects in 2021. And yeah, as always, there will be a hint for what my next video is on at the end of this video, and I will catch you all in the next one. Bye!